All right, a guide to conditioning with a sled or a prowler. We're going to try to keep this as brief as it can be, but we're also going to try to be thorough so that this is actually useful to you. So 5 parts here. Number 1, the differences between a sled and a prowler. Number 2, the benefits of conditioning with a tool like this. Number 3, we're going to cover 5 different workouts that you can do with a sled or a prowler. And then number 4, the modifications that you can make to those workouts, which basically give you an infinite number of workouts. And then number 5, the different surfaces that you're going to be potentially pushing or pulling a sled or a prowler on, and what kind of a difference that's going to make. Number 1, the difference between a prowler and a sled, and an option for you if it's not in the financial cards right now to go out and buy one of these. So let's start over here. This is typically referred to as a prowler. A prowler is going to have 3 skids. It will have 2 vertical handles or 2 uprights here, and then it will have either 1 or 2 horizontal handles. This is typically referred to as a sled. A sled is going to usually it's just going to have 2 uprights. We happen to have more uprights, so all 4 uprights are in here right now, but it's typically going to have 2 handles or 2 vertical uprights. It's going to have 2 runners or 2 skids. In general, we kind of colloquially refer to them both as a sled, but technically, this is the sled and this is the prowler. Now, they're both great conditioning tools. We tend to use this one more, but they're both great options, and they're essentially, for all practical purposes, they're the same. Now, if it's not in the financial cards for you to go out and get one of these, you can make yourself a very cheap dragging sled. It doesn't work very well for pushing at all, but it does work very well for dragging. You're going to grab an old tire, and you can typically get these for free at a lot of places, and you're typically going to put in an eye bolt or 2, and this way you can hook up a harness to it, or you can hook up a toe strap or something like that. I will say, if you're going to go this route, and I don't know if you can see this on camera, but we've drilled holes into this tire because depending on how you're going to store it, it is going to catch and store water and will become a mosquito breeding ground. So you just want to make sure that however you're going to store it, you've probably got some holes drilled through there, so that in the case that water gets in there, that water is able to drain out as well. Part 2, why do we like conditioning with the sled or the prowler so much? Well, we don't enjoy it, but we appreciate conditioning with the sled a lot. And the reason is that there is no eccentric loading. It's all concentric loading, which means you're not generating a whole bunch of soreness. So this way it's not interfering. Your conditioning, you can get a huge cardiovascular, you can get a huge conditioning benefit from using these tools without encountering a whole bunch of soreness that is then going to interfere with your hopefully very productive strength training. It's worth noting that bikes fit into this category as well, rowers fit into this category, so both of those are great conditioning tools as well. I have a much stronger preference for using a sled for the silly reason that I feel like I'm actually going somewhere with a sled or a prowler as opposed to a bike or a rower where I'm just, stationary. Now, don't get me wrong, I end up back in the same place, so that may be silly, but I just enjoy it more with a sled than with a bike or a rower. All right, part 3, the part that you really came for, let's get to some of the workouts here. Workout number 1, very straightforward. This is by far the one that I use the most often when we're introducing the sled with somebody. This is the one that I usually use. It's the one that, by default, I will just gravitate toward myself. It is either 12, 16, or 20 rounds of pushing the sled 50 feet. So we've got a nice 50-foot distance here in the gym on the turf, so I'm going to start a stopwatch, and at the 0 mark, right when I start, I'm going to push the sled 50 feet, all right? Maybe that takes me 20 seconds. Probably doesn't actually take me 20 seconds, but let's just say it takes me 20 seconds. That means of that minute, I have 40 seconds of rest left at the end. When the next minute starts, so when the stopwatch hits the 1-minute mark, now I'm going to start pushing the sled back 50 feet. So down and back, that would be 2 rounds, right? Every time I push the sled, that's 1 round. So you can either do 12 rounds, you can do 16 rounds, you can do 20 rounds. Over time, you're going to progress this. That's why we've got a 12, a 16, and a 20. Then you're going to ratchet it back down. You're going to add a little bit of weight. You'll notice we didn't do 10, 15, and 20. You certainly could, but if you do 15, you're going to end up at the other end where you're not probably going to keep storing your sled. So you're going to have to push the sled back anyway, so you're going to end up with 16 rounds. So that's why we chose 12, 16, and 20. It's worth noting that you are loading the sled up to a challenging weight. So you're not just going to be able to sprint the sled down to the other side. You're loading it up to a challenging weight. It should be hard to push the thing. Workout number 2, this is just a longer version, therefore this is coming on longer intervals as well. So this one, if we were doing this here, you can do it inside, you're going down and back because it's 100 feet, but you can also do it outdoors. So you might do 8 rounds, 10 rounds, or 12 rounds. You can of course choose the rounds, you can choose the distances. These are just sample workouts, right? So you're gonna do 8 rounds, 10 rounds, or 12 rounds of pushing the sled 100 feet. So you push it 100 feet, maybe that's a down and a back because it's 50 feet and 50 feet if we're doing it indoors, or maybe it's a long run outside. You're pushing it 100 feet, you're waiting until the end of that 2 minutes. So again, like the other one, you're starting a stopwatch at the beginning, but then you're starting a new round not every minute, but every 2 minutes. Beyond that, it's very similar to the first one. Workout number 3, you're gonna choose a distance. This is a sled pyramid. You're gonna choose a distance, whether it's 100 feet or a 200 foot. If it's 100 feet, you're probably gonna use more weight. If it's 200 feet, you're gonna use less weight, but you're gonna do 4, 5, 6, or 7 levels of adding weight every round and then subtracting weight back down to the initial weight. So let's say we're starting with this sled as it is right now. This has got 2 100 plates on it, which is pretty much the only sane use of a 100-pound plate, because in general they're just a pain in the butt to move around, so we use them for the sled a lot. So let's say you're starting round 1, and let's say you're doing 100 feet down, and so we're doing 50 feet down here in the gym and then 50 feet back, so that's 100 feet, right? So you push the sled, you push 200 pounds down and back, that's 1 round, all right? Then you add a little bit of weight. Maybe you add a 25-pound plate onto here. So you go down and back again. Then you add another 25-pound plate, right? This is now on level 3 of the pyramid, right? Then you add another 25-pound plate, all right? So you've done, let's say you've done 4 rounds. So you made it up to, what did we start with? 200, then we had 225, then we had 250, then we had 275. We do a 5th round, that's 300 pounds. Now we're taking it back down the other way. So now we're going back down to 275, then we're going back down to 250, then 225, then 200. So bear in mind, however many levels you choose, you're going to have almost twice that many rounds to do, right? So if you have 5 levels, you're going to have 9 rounds. So just bear that in mind when you're choosing how many rounds you're going to do. For the rest here, you're just going to rest as needed. In the beginning, when the weight is lighter, you might not need to rest very long. You might push the sled down and back. You probably want to do down backs with this one, by the way, because you want to end up back where your kind of weight source actually is. So you push the sled down and back, it was relatively light, you grab the next weight, you put it on the sled, you go again. After the second round, maybe you rest a little bit longer because it got a little bit harder. By the time you get to that top level, you're probably going to need to rest a little bit longer yet. So just rest as needed on this. Workout number 4, you're going to want a harness because you're going to be pulling the sled. You're going to want to be walking forward while pulling the sled in this case. So let's briefly cover now. Of course, you can go out and buy a harness, but you can also make a harness. The harness we're using here in this video is made out of 1-inch climbing webbing. This is the same strap or the same climbing webbing that we use for our lifting strap. So it's very durable. It's only 1 inch wide, so it's not the most comfortable harness in the world, but then again, conditioning is rarely comfortable. But if you've got something that is like 1.5 inches or 2 inches wide, if you've got an old toe strap that you don't mind cutting up and using, that can certainly work. Seatbelt strap, something like that. But the way you're going to do this is you're going to use what is called, you're going to make what is called a water knot. Now to tie a water knot will work real well for tying up, for creating a knot in webbing specifically like this, because you're using something that is flat. So to tie a water knot, you're simply going to create an overhand knot. So you're going to create a loop and you're going to pass the strap, you're going to pass the webbing back through that. So you're simply creating a very straightforward overhand knot. Then with the other end of the webbing, and you're going to have probably about a piece of webbing that's about 8 to 9 feet long, something in that neighborhood. Then you're going to take the other end of the webbing and you're simply going to follow that webbing backwards along the initial overhand knot. So you're just going to follow the knot backwards until you have 2 tails. Now you want to make sure when you originally set up the first overhand knot that you probably got several inches, let's say, 4, 5, 6 inches of tail, and you want to have 4 to 5, 6 inches of tail on the other side as well. So once the knot is tied, now you're just going to snug up the knot. You're going to dress it, making sure that the tails are being pulled snugly as well as the loop itself. So now you have something that will serve very well for a harness. You're simply going to use, what we're using here is a toe strap. So the toe strap is hooked up to the tire in this case, but you could obviously hook it up to your sled. So you're going to hook your toe strap up to your tire or to your sled. You put that loop through, the loop is your harness, you put that loop through the other end of that strap, and now you've basically got backpack straps, right? You've got a harness. So the workout itself is you are going to push the sled, you're going to pull the sled. You could do this pushing, by the way, but I would not recommend it. So you're going to pull the sled for 5 minutes, and then you're going to rest 3 minutes. Then you're going to do that again, pull the sled for 5 minutes, rest 3 minutes, and then pull the sled for 5 minutes again. So it's 3 rounds of pulling for 5 minutes with a 3-minute break in between. As with all of these, but especially with this one, load it conservatively at first. Otherwise, your ego is going to be writing checks that your body cannot cash. So if you're deciding you're going to add more weight, you might want to give yourself a round or 2 on any of these before you actually do that, because the stress tends to build a little bit unexpectedly at times. It is also worth noting that while you can do this workout indoors, I would highly recommend that you have an outdoor space for it, because most of the time if you're doing it indoors, you're just going to be turning around all the time. And last, workout number 5, this is going to be a time-based one. So it's not distance-based, it's time-based, and you're simply going to do 10 rounds of pushing the sled as far as you can. So you're going to set up a given weight, and then you're going to push the sled as far as you can. Again, a challenging weight, but you're going to push the sled as far as you can for 30 seconds, and then you're going to rest a minute and a half, and then you're going to push the sled again for 30 seconds, and then rest a minute and a half. So if you're outdoors and you've got a run where you can actually push the sled for 30 seconds, for however long, however far that takes you, that's real ideal. You can do it indoors as well. It's just most likely, for example, if we're indoors here in 50 feet, there's probably going to be at least one turnaround involved, possibly multiple turnarounds involved. All right, part 4, what are some of the modifications that we can make to this training modality so that you can increase the difficulty? Because over time, you are going to become better conditioned. So we want to be able to increase the difficulty to kind of match your level of conditioning. You've got a couple options, some of which are you can increase the load on the sled, you can increase the distance that you're pushing the sled, you can increase the number of rounds that you're performing, and you can also, of course, decrease the amount of rest that you're giving yourself. So that's 4 options right there, which basically gives you an infinite number of options. You can also, we'll come back to this in a moment, you can also change it up from pulling versus pushing. But let's cover 2 of those options and see how this might play out in a real example here. So let's go back to workout number 1, that 12, 16, or 20 rounds of you're pushing the sled 50 feet every minute on the minute. This is by far the sled workout that I use the most myself. It's the default one that I start people with on day 1 if they're new to using the sled. And when you're new to using the sled, start with a very manageable weight. Yes, it should be challenging, especially eventually, but you don't want to throw up on day 1 of using the sled. Ideally, you're never going to throw up when you're using the sled or doing any other conditioning, but it may happen. So with this in mind, let's start with 12 rounds at a manageable weight. We're going to use 2 things. We're going to increase the number of rounds and we're going to increase the weight, but we are not going to increase them at the same time. So let's say someone starts with, let's not do 200 pounds, let's say we start with 100 pounds. And by the way, you may not know what your sled weighs. That doesn't really matter. When I'm recording this in my book, I'm not recording the weight of the sled. I'm just recording the 200 pounds that is on there, however many plates we've got on there, the total weight of the plates. So let's say we're starting with 100 pounds, all right? So you're doing 100 pounds for 12 rounds. And then the next week, let's say I'm doing my conditioning on Tuesdays. So the next week, I might do that same 100 pounds, but now I'm doing it for 16 rounds. And then the following week, I'm doing 100 pounds for 20 rounds. And now I'm kind of going to graduate from 100 pounds. I'm going to ratchet it back down to 12 rounds, but I'm going to add a little bit of weight. Maybe I'm going to add a 25-pound plate. So now I'm doing 125 pounds, and I'm going to do 12 rounds. And then the following week, 16 rounds. And then the following week, 20 rounds. Once I get up to 20 rounds again, I'm graduating from that weight, I'm ratcheting it back down to 12, and I'm doing 150 pounds. Now, could you do 12 and then 14 and 16 and 18 and 20? Sure, this is just an example, 12, 16, and 20. But that gives you some ideas of how you can change the load, how you can change the number of rounds. Of course, you could decrease the amount of rest, right? If you're doing the sled drag for 5 minutes and resting for 3 minutes, you could take that rest down to 2.5 minutes one week. And then the next week, you could take it down to 2 minutes. And then you might take it down to 1.5 minutes. And then the week after that, if you're still doing it, that consistently, hopefully, then you might take it back up to a 3-minute rest, but now you might add a little bit of weight because you've been doing whatever the previous weight was for several weeks in a row. So this gives you some options. Another option is simply changing out. Now this is really more for interest than anything else, just to keep it kind of interesting, but you can change whether or not you are pushing or pulling the sled. So for example, when you see me doing the sled pyramid right here, on this particular day I decided I didn't want to push the sled both directions, so I pushed the sled in one direction and I pulled the sled in the other direction. That's a valid way to do it too. You'll notice this gives you a different way of pulling the sled also. If you've got a toe strap, you can just put the thing around your hips and you can drag it backwards that way. All right, part 5, the surfaces that you're going to be pushing a sled on or dragging a sled on. Let's start with some of the surfaces that move pretty darn well. If you are pushing on turf like we have here, or you're pushing on that nice, very smooth, very polished concrete, I don't know if that's the technical name for it, but you probably know the type of concrete that I'm talking about, you're going to be able to load the sled up pretty darn heavy. If you're a strong guy or a strong gal, you're probably going to have hundreds of pounds potentially on that sled as you're pushing or pulling it. The turf or the polished concrete is going to slide slide pretty well. Now you're moving on to asphalt from there. So the moment you move to asphalt, which is what we have in the back of the gym here, the moment you move to asphalt, there's going to be a significant reduction in weight. There's always a chance also that you're going to get a little pebble stuck underneath one of the skids or something like that, and that's going to throw a wrench in the works. So you're going to have less weight for sure on asphalt. If you're using the tire that I was using for that sled drag, that is going to be even less than that. Remember, a tire is actually manufactured to have friction between itself and, asphalt, or itself and concrete. So whatever you're using on a sled, it's probably going to be even less on a tire, for instance. And then the worst surface to do it on, it still works just fine, but the most kind of pain in the butt surface is that type of brushed concrete, that type of brushed concrete that you'd see on a sidewalk or on a road or something like that. There's a lot of friction there. I'm going to come back to asphalt here in a moment, because asphalt could potentially be worse. But the brushed concrete, you will have relatively little weight on the sled compared to pretty much any of the other surfaces. The exception potentially to that is the type of asphalt that we have out back, and a lot of you may have this type of asphalt available to you as well, is the type of asphalt that has a whole bunch of repaired seams, right? It's got a bunch of cracked seams that have been sealed again. So every time you run across that sealant, that type of rubbery surface, especially on a hot day, man, that is a bear to go across. You will quickly learn to try to avoid it as much as you possibly can, but every time you go across that, especially on hotter days, it's going to make a difference in how much weight you're able to put on the sled, and there's going to be kind of sudden slowdowns in your conditioning experience, to the point where we have a different sled that we use outside versus a sled that we use indoors, because the outdoor sled will pick up some of that tar, and we don't want that tar, or whatever that stuff is called, being spread out over our turf right here. Now, last thing I'll mention is there are some sled manufacturers, Rogue, for instance. I'm sure there's a bunch of them that do it. I don't pay that much attention to it because we don't have them, but there are some manufacturers that make some plastic skids, some plastic runners that go on your sled to kind of protect the metal skids, so hopefully you don't have to replace them. Quite frankly, if it's just you and the sled, your runners are going to last your runners are going to last forever anyway. But I have heard, but have no personal experience with this, I have heard that with those plastic skids, it goes a little bit better on concrete than it would otherwise. I don't know if that's actually the case. That's just what I've heard. Your mileage may vary. So, as always, we hope this helps you get stronger, or at least in this case, better conditioned, and live better.